Lily woke to the rain. It was not a single thin voice, but a steady chorus, 100 small fingers on the panes, each one precise and private. The sound had the same careful cadence as a sand glass, a quiet counting that folded the morning into itself. Through the leaded windows the light was a soft gray, the sort that made colors seem to have remembered themselves slowly, as if someone had begun to hum, and the room answered in wool and steam. She lay for a moment under the patchwork. Blue squares softened at the corners, stitches that remembered hands, listening to the house settle around the weather. The cottage felt larger in the dim, as if rooms had had time overnight to gather all their remembered warmth. The stove in the kitchen gave a low, steady sigh, where embers still kept a small, trustworthy heat. Somewhere in the row of chimneys a gull would call if it dared. Today there were only droplets, and the small metallic note of water finding its way along the eaves. She moved slowly, the way people who keep rituals do, with a measured deliberation that honors the thing being done. Her feet were warmed by a pair of slippers worn soft at the heel. She drew the blanket aside, smoothed the cloth on the back of a chair with a thumb that knew the exact place to press. In the small dark of the bedroom, the scent that would come to dominate the day, bergamot, a faint citrus brightness folded into cinnamon, and something deeper, like molasses, seemed only a preface. She pulled on a wool cardigan, the buttons catching her fingers like little familiar tasks, and padded down the narrow stairs. The kitchen awaited her like a well-remembered book. Oilskins and baking tins, pots hung from hooks that had bowed slightly with years, the round-backed chair by the table with one leg sanded and oiled where a child had once used it as a step. The range held the night's hush, a slumbering warmth, a cradle for the kettle. Lily set the kettle on the back of the stove, closer to the gentle heat, and began the small ceremonial measures. A scoop of tea for the pot, black with a leaf that smelled bright enough to wake the tongue, a teaspoon of sugar into a bowl, a pinch of cinnamon on the side for when the twins liked to lace their cups with a hint of something scandalous and sweet. She had long ago learned to respect the hour that follows the waking of a rainy Sunday. The house stills its ordinary demands and allows ritual to be the day's first true necessity. Her movements were exact but light. The flour tipped into a mixing bowl, the measured handfuls of currants, the way she folded in grated zest so it pooled like threads of sun through the batter. Her hands found the old wooden spoon, worn smooth by years of stirring, and walked it in circles as if coaxing music from a remembered instrument. The kettle gave one polite whistle, and the house answered in steam. Lily lifted the pot, porcelain warm against her palms. The handle knew her, the glaze nicked in the way that confirmed its age. She poured, the dark water meeting the teapot's brim with a soft, decisive sound, then set the teapot onto a folded cloth to steep. She measured out the pastry with a practiced thumb and forefinger, pressing the dough for scones as if to remind it of its purpose. The scent of citrus and spice gathered in the air like an invitation. If you like, stay a while and let the rain keep you company. She liked the way that line felt in the mouth of the morning, an offer rather than a summons. She had a way of thinking about the house as a conversation. Tea began it, conversation opened it wider, and work, the nourishing, necessary work of patching a seam or sweeping a hearth, carried it into the day. A Sunday was an extended greeting, a lingering of neighbors and songs under their breath. By the time the kettle had stopped sighing, the kitchen was filling with small, ordinary music. The spoon that beat the batter on the edge of the bowl, the brush of a cloth over a table, the soft clink of china down the sideboard. Outside, the rain steadied in its rhythm, a gentle insistence that everything could be set aside and made gentle in return. There was a shuffling at the front door, then the 3 knock that Seamus favored, one slow, 2 quicker, as if remembering some old game for whom to let in. Seamus himself appeared soon after, his hat tucked over one ear and his cane tapping a friendly punctuation on the threshold. His pockets were a small cartography of useful things, a coil of string, a small roll of leather, a tin of rusty nails that had never quite lost their pride. He smelled of peat and the distant river, and when he smiled, the lines at the corner of his eyes drew a map of many winters. "Good morning, Lily," he said, his voice a warm instrument. He shook rain from his coat onto the mat as if scattering a small blessing. "Smells like you've been busy." Lily laughed, the sound like the cup she wiped clean. "Only the usual," she said. "Tea's on." Rose arrived not long after, with a hamper wrapped in oiled cloth and smelling of damp earth and green things. Her hands were still dusted with loam, the way a gardener's are, even in November. She carried a bundle of sprigs tied with string. Rosemary, a sprig of lavender gone graceful with age, and a small branch of hardy geranium leaves. Rose's hair had a loose halo from being coaxed back with a tie taken at the elbow, and her smile held the kind of practical joy that meant she had already planned where the parsley would go in Lily's window box. "Morning," Rose said, stepping into the kitchen as if the room had always been her proper place. She set the hamper down and unfurled a piece of bread to test the weather, murmuring to no one in particular about the small, delicate art of keeping things alive through leaky eaves. Soon after the twins arrived, bringing a gust of small, busy air and the sound of laces being retied. Mara and Joss were nearly unmistakable together. They traded mischief like a language and kept one another's secrets in a pocket. Mara had flour on her chin and a smudge on her sleeve, and Joss carried a little bag of treasures they'd declared pockets of proper invention. Buttons, a red bead, a loop of green glass. They sat themselves at the table as if it had been arranged for precisely 2 small command seats, and prodded the bowl of scone mix as if giving it advice. "Are we helping?" Mara asked, eyes wide. She always asked with the kind of hopeful deference that made asking the more pleasurable part than actually helping. "Load, of course," Lily said, and set them each a spoon. Children had a way of lending urgency to the best rituals. Giving them a small task made the day feel larger inside the kitchen, like a room with extra chairs at the table. Conversation in those hours was an even, manageable thing. Stories told in the short syllables of local weather. Gossip folded into the names of people's hens. The small catastrophes of gutters and missing buttons and the slow progress of gardens. Seamus talked of an old gate that needed new hinge work. Rose confided she had coaxed a stubborn rose to bloom with a feed of ashes and tea leaves. The twins insisted the cat would have done better with a saucer of scone crumbs. They moved around one another in the domestic choreography of long acquaintance. Someone stood to check the oven. Another reached for the cloth to dry a plate. Hands brushed over jars of jam as if blessing them. The house spoke back with its own soft noises. The kettle's last sigh as it warmed for a second pot. The oven's low murmur. The clock's fabric soft tick. Each sound repeated itself through the morning, an anchor for attention, a promise that nothing urgent would leap into the room. Lily found the rhythm in those repetitions. She measured the jam, slid pies into the oven, and wiped flour from the edges of the table with the flat of her hand until the grains caught like a fine dust of day. At some point, between the setting of plates and a story about Seamus's wartime bicycle that worked as both demonstration of character and small joke, Lily moved to the hearth to lift a baking tray, and felt, at the edge of her awareness, a different rhythm. A tiny, persistent irregularity in the sound of the rain against the front of the cottage. It wasn't that the rain had changed. Rather, it was that part of the house answered it differently. She went to the bay window by habit before she could tell herself why, stepping into the shallow light with the mind of someone who tended detail. The bay window had always been Lily's favorite place. A padded sill worn into the curve of a body, a place where afternoons gathered like small, comfortable garments. Today, the window presented a precise, small grief. Where the oilskin awning that sheltered the porch met the leaded edge, a seam had begun to give. A thin, stubborn little trickle had worked its way down inside the awning's fold, and, where the putty met the glass, a hairline seam had split enough to let a cool, determined thread of water find its way into the sill. It was almost comical in its modesty. Not a hole one might feed a hand through, merely a seam the colors of an old coin where the glue had softened. The drip had left a pale path through the paint, a quiet announcement that the house had been weathered in one more tiny place. Lily's fingers touched the sill, cool, a little damp, and she felt the small, very particular kind of concern that comes with noticing what will take care in the future. She stood there for a moment, listening. The sound of the rain held on the window as if it were reluctant to be the messenger of any news. Inside, the oven hummed. The kettle made its polite noises. Voices threaded the room like friendly thread. To do anything about the seam required tools, perhaps some leather or waxed thread, a smear of putty, a pause in the day's easy unfoldings. To mend it properly would mean interrupting the gentleness they had gathered. Lily considered the thing, the way a person considers a letter marked urgent that might really be no more than a suggestion. She thought of Seamus's basket of oddments, Rose's string, the twins' pockets of treasure. She saw, as plainly as if it were offered to her on a plate, the simple pleasures of company, and the way a problem became less heavy when it was known by more than one set of hands. She walked back to the table with a little of the dampness catching at the toe of her slipper. The twins were bent over a saucer, using crumbs as currency in a negotiation with the cat. Seamus had a story that kept needing retelling, because each time it made them laugh, new detail arrived, as if the narrative could not stand to be concise. "It's only a small thing," Seamus said later, catching her eye across the table and lowering his voice in that conspiratorial way the old had when telling the young that life preserved its small amusements. "We can always tie a bit of leather over it and press the seam. That'll keep it until the morning's clearer." Rose set her teacup down with a soft clink. She had listened, as gardeners listen to soil, to the subtle things that needed tending. "I'll fetch some wax," she offered. "There's some in the shed. It won't take long." Mara and Joss watched the exchange with the intentness of those who know that any small repair might be an occasion for making something beautiful. "Can we make it look pretty?" Mara asked. "Like a badge?" "You can put it in your pocket, then," Joss said, though he spoke in a tone that admitted he rather liked the idea of a decorative seam. Lily smiled at them all, feeling the tightness of attention loosen from her chest. The seam was a matter of small consequence. It was not a crisis. It carried rather the promise of shared minutes, the kind that knit one life to another without fuss. The wind that sought to find the gap in the wood had been about the business of weathering cottages for generations. One more seam to mend was a way of asserting that the house mattered enough to be repaired, and that the people who used it valued its keeping. She set another tray into the oven with a precise motion and turned to catch the light. There were things she would need to do if she was to mend the seam properly. A smear of putty, a strip of leather, maybe a night with the awning secured until the next dry day allowed a thorough stitch. But for the moment there was tea and the slow comfort of those at her table. The decision to postpone was not neglect, but a choice in favor of companionship. The house would wait for the hands of those who loved it, and often the house rewarded such patience with something soft, a story, a song, a plate held out for supper. Outside, the rain took on a different character. It hit the roof with a steady, comforting thoroughness, each drop an unhurried messenger. The kettle was filled for the third time, and the small circle at the table expanded to include more stories. Lily told one of the twins about a patch she had favored on a coat and how it had come to be sewn in the corner. Seamus produced from his coat a small brass washer and handed it over as though it might start some new project. Rose spoke of seeds she had kept back for the brave ones, and the twins plotted where a sun-catcher might be hung to catch the last of the day's thin light. The household noises became their own liturgy. The measure of a spoon, the scrape of a chair, the muffled footfall on the mat as someone came and went. Lily found herself listening, as though each sound were a verse, each voice a soft chorus. There was a hymn in the way the teapot steamed when the lid was left slightly askew, in the way the oven light stilled like a small sun. She thought of the patchwork blanket on her bed, and how it had been pieced together by hands of those who had lived, and lost, and loved. The sill at the bay window might be damp for a day or two. It would not be forgotten. It had become, in the span of an afternoon, less of a problem and more of a reason to attend. As the morning moved on, the rain softened, the sound of it like someone lowering their voice to a confidant. People spoke less loudly. Words thinned into pleasant, small confessions. I planted the wrong tuber last year. And laughter came brief and bright when the twins staged a small mock trial for a sooty spoon, prosecuting it for crimes of excessive stickiness. The soup that would form the evening's slow meal was discussed with a manner worthy of composers. What stock? What marrow? Whether to add a drop of vinegar to cut through richness. Decisions were made in the low voices of friends who trusted one another to make the sensible choice. Mid-afternoon had a color to it that Lily always liked. Not bright, not dim. A steady, honest light that made the kitchen feel as if it had been wrapped in linen. The scones browned in the oven, and the smell of their crust mingled with the citrus and spice already in the room. Lily brushed flour from her hands and found herself, without quite noticing, at the bay window again. The seam, when she looked upon it, was still modest. The dribble of rain had left a faint darker ribbon, and a spider had begun to spin a patient loop in a corner where she might later tuck a length of thread. The wood, damp for the moment, showed the faint grain like a map of small histories. At that point there was a small knock at the door that did not belong to Seamus or Rose, a different rhythm entirely. The mat buckled as new souls came in. A neighbor she did not oft see during the week, an elderly woman with a shawl and the slow decorum of someone who kept to her own pace, stepped inside with thanks on her lips for the cup Lily had promised that morning. She carried nothing but a small tin of jam, and a look that suggested the world might yet be put right by a listening ear and a slice of cake. The come and go of people on a rainy Sunday is not a matter of logistics, but of moral economy. You give a seat, you pass a story on, you bloom cookies on a plate, and you return the kindness later. The seam at the bay window remained a soft question at the edge of the day. Lily smiled as she poured another cup, and when Seamus leaned in with that small, certain grin, she felt the weight lift sufficiently to make a different choice. They would mend it together, yes. They would stitch and wax and make the seam something almost ceremonious. But not now. Not while the kettle still sang and the oven breathed. She set the teapot down, and the group gathered close as if drawn by the event of comfort rather than by any pressing need. The twins were given the task of arranging sugar lumps into a small tower, which they performed with the solemnity of priests at minor rites. Rose passed a board of scones and tapped one in the middle for all to share, as if by its very breaking the afternoon might be confirmed. Seamus produced a tale about a spring that had been coaxed into a village pipe with nothing but patience and a forgotten spoon. Laughter and tea and the smell of pastry marked the hours as they softened into one another, even as the light thinned and the rain's voice steadied to a whisper. Lily found that the seam had moved from being a single blade of worry into a shared cord. It had given them a reason to sit together, to trade the small attentions that take the hard edges off any household. She felt, in the soft space between two sips of tea, that the house had done its work in bringing people close. The repair would wait until morning, or perhaps until the late afternoon when the light would make a better seam of things. There was time enough for wax and leather and the careful hand of Seamus that never hurried. For now there were stories to tell, and crumbs to be saved for the cat. The house was becoming an interior of warmth and sound, spoons clinking, the low murmur of voices, the cling of a cup being set upon saucer. Somewhere upstairs the blanket hummed with a remembered dream, and the patchwork squares gleamed faintly in the lingering light. Lily pressed the heel of her hand to her cheek, feeling the small, generous tiredness that comes of a day lived well in company. She stood, smoothing her skirt with an automatic gentleness, and opened a drawer for extra napkins as if the simple act might extend the kindness present. A little later, when the afternoon light trembled and the rain let itself become a soft, persistent pattern, someone hummed a tune that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with being together in a small kitchen. It was a hum that gathered smaller sounds into it. The kettle's last spill of steam, the oven's patient breath, the rain's constant hand on the roof. It was the kind of sound that stitches time into a seam as surely as thread sews fabric together. Just then, the twins lifted themselves from the table with a mission. Mara, who had been practicing a certain solemnity all morning, held up a scrap of cellophane they had traded for a red bead. "We'll make something for the window," she declared with the conviction of an inventor. Like the sun for wet days. They set to the task with the absorption of people who know small hands can make great things. Buttons were threaded, lengths of string selected with deliberation, and the scrap became a tiny glass that promised to catch the last of the day's light. Lily found herself watching as if the act were as close to a small miracle as one needed. Children transforming a scrap into a bright, delicate claim that the house could be made to hold light even on the wettest day. Outside, the rain softened until the noise itself seemed to fold inward, to become part of the hush that presaged evening. The kitchen's shadows lengthened like letters being read aloud, and the stove's heat warmed the backs of people's hands. Lily moved about with the ease of someone who has kept the same house through several seasons. She set a small pot of jam on the sill where a late passer might see it and think to call in. If you should be late, put your head in for a cup. The act was small, the generosity exact and canonical. For all the comforts, the seam at the bay window had a way of insisting on its future. It was a tiny thing in a day otherwise full of small abundance. That insistence, the house whispering for attention, made the afternoon feel like a note held between chords. Important but not urgent, noticeable but soft. Lily liked that it existed. She liked that the day had made room to notice. As twilight threatened, a thickening gray that would soon become night, Lily rose to gather the remaining plates. The twins were already stringing their little cellophane sun and debating where to hang it. Seamus leaned in the doorway, as if he had been called by some old bell that only he could hear. Rose folded the oiled cloth about the last of the bread with the careful devotion of someone wrapping a small memory. They made plans that were as simple as they were sure. Wax from Rose's shed, leather from Seamus's pocket, a smear of putty put aside to dry in the morning. Perhaps, one of them suggested, they would stitch it, and stitch in a small ribbon so that from the inside the repair would look more like intention than fix. The idea pleased everyone, as such ideas do, because it turned a mending into an act of design and called for small hands and fine patience. Lily tied her cardigan at the waist and felt the warmth of the stove seep through her bones. She looked at the assembled fragments of people and tools, and felt the soft satisfaction that comes when everything finds its place for the time being. They would, she thought, make an afternoon of mending when the day allowed. For now, she would keep the light on a while and let the rain do what it had come to do. Finish its sing-song on the leaded panes, and leave them with a house that had been given more attention than most days warranted. She placed the last plate on the sideboard and, without ceremony, touched the sill at the bay window one more time. The wood had cooled in the spaces the day's warmth had touched. In that coolness she felt the history of every hand that had come before hers to press putty into place. The seam was not a rupture to be feared, but a detail that would soon hold the story of the afternoon. Who had leaned? Who had laughed? Which child had tied the ribbon crooked, and which elder had advised patience? It would, she knew, show the marks of many hands in its eventual finish. As the light fell away and the room softened further into candle and lamp, the small household prepared for the evening's rounding. The conversation thinned into easy, necessary things. Who would fetch coal tomorrow? Whether there would be fruit enough for a tart. The twins were given a tale to tell the cat later, and were happily sent to practice the hanging of their little son, which they took very seriously, fathering each movement with solemnity. When the door closed behind the last soft-footed visitor, Lily stood alone for a moment in the hush. The house exhaled in the comfortable after-sounds of plates being stacked and a kettle left to its second cool. The seam at the bay window held a promise, and the tools that would mend it were already imagined in enough detail that the repair felt less a chore and more a small festival planned for the next dry morning. She arranged the napkins, smoothed the blanket on the chair, and set one small plate of leftover scone by the window. A quiet beacon for any wayfarer who might still come by late, willful and hopeful. There are days, she thought, when the weather writes the agenda, and other days when the people do. This had been one of the latter. A rainy day surrendered to the warmth of a kitchen, to the steady company of neighbors, to the small, exact work of making and telling. Outside, the rain kept up its patient song, and inside, the kitchen lights gathered the day's memories into a small hoard of kindness. She made ready to attend to the night's smallest duty, to set the kettle for a last warming, to place the covers where they would be easily found, to tuck a candle by the sill, and then, with the ease of someone who knows how to let things fold, She stepped back from the window and moved to the table where the twins had left a scrap of cellophane catching a last fleck of light. The seam would be mended, they had agreed. There was no hurry in the consensus. Such things, when done by hand and by many, acquired a dignity not present in hurried fixes. Lily lit a small lamp, and the room glowed with an honest, modest light. The rain outside softened to a hush. She paused, the way people pause when they are about to write a letter, and smoothed her hands over the patchwork once more. The house held, as always, the thin line between what needed to be done and what could wait for the good company of hands. Tonight it would wait. Tonight it would wait. Lily moved through the kitchen with the soft deliberation of someone closing a book she intended to open again. She set a small saucer of scone crumbs by the back door for any late traveler, and brushed the crumbs into a neat, hospitable pile as if tucking in the cottage itself. The lamp she had lit earlier threw a small circle of gold over the tablecloth. She drew the chair nearer and smoothed its back with a thumb that knew every nick and scar. She set the kettle on the hob for one last warming, no more than a polite heat to offer the house a final breath, and then went about the small private tasks that made the house a place to rest. She put a book by the bed, the sort of slim, claspless volume that read like a companion, and folded the edges of the cover with habitual care. The blanket at the foot of the bed had been turned over so the worn pattern faced up, a small courtesy to the room that had kept her for so long. Lily checked the latch on the kitchen door, the way an old friend checks a hat before leaving a party, and left the wick of the lamp trimmed so that it would not smoke in the cool night air. From the sill of the bay window, she gave one last look at the seam. Under the lamplight it was a gentle crescent, a pale line that gleamed with a promise of work. She pressed her fingers to it and felt the coolness that the rain had left behind. The touch was quick and comforting, a reminder of the way hands are the first and last thing a house remembers. She moved slowly upstairs. The patchwork blanket, with its squares of soft blue and sun-faded rose, lay folded back as if waiting to enfold a body. The hush of the house was not empty. It had the shape of people, of laughter that had just left, of teacups settling in the sink, of a spoon still damp in the bowl. It felt like a held breath. The rain continued, a steady string of small percussion on the roof, and Lily let the sound settle her as she would a child in the crook of an arm. She slipped into bed with the calm of someone who had finished a day's proper tending. Sleep came like the last pages of a favorite book, inevitable, soft, with a sense that the narrative might pick up again in the morning where it had left off. In the dark, she conjured a quiet scene she would walk into later. Seamus arriving with his oddments, Rose's lantern in the shed, the twins with their bright, ridiculous notions. In sleep, they were both more and less than persons. They were the idea of hands reaching toward a common seam. Morning found the world washed of any sharpness. The rain had gone to a gentler rhythm, the sort of rain that left its story in beads on the glass instead of in sheets. The air smelled of damp earth and of scones, and of the faint, sweet trace of the jam they'd left by the window. Lily woke before the house had fully gathered its day, and sat for a moment with her feet in the slippers, letting the hush of early morning sink in. There was a quality to mornings after rain that pleased her. Colors seemed more faithful, the small details sharper, as if the world had cleaned its spectacles overnight. She made the kettle a brisker fire on the range and wrapped her hands around a warmed mug while she waited. The stove sighed a comfortable note as the fire took, and the kettle hummed its steady, familiar tune. Lily moved through her ritual, as if greeting an old friend. A measured scoop of tea. The patent patience of waiting for the leaves to bloom. The precise way sugar was tipped into a saucer for the twins to pluck. She dressed in a cardigan with elbow patches that had been mended more than once and pinned on a practical apron. The day would call for hands that were both nimble and ready to kneel. She liked having her clothes say the same. When she opened the front door, the damp air greeted her with a small, green smell. The porch held the day in its shallow bowl, and the awning above the door drooped in a way that made its fault more visible in the honest light. The seam had bled its last dampness into the wood overnight, and left the grain darkened where the trickle had run. Lily's breath softened. There was no shame in it. It was, she thought, the sort of fault that could be known and mended, a piece of work that would make the house feel properly kept. Before long there came the 3 knocks, Seamus's arrival by punctual ritual, and his cane tapping a companionable rhythm as he stepped inside. He came bearing the air of someone with a small plan, pockets jingling with implements that might well be useless to any other, but proved exactly the sort of thing one needed in an hour of minor crisis. "Morning," he said, removing his hat and shaking out the damp as if he were a bell. When he saw Lily, he tipped his head in the sort of appraisal that always doubled as praise. Rose arrived with her own quiet decisiveness, her boots a smudge on the mat, but her hands steady and certain. In her arms she bore a roll of beeswax wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth and a tin of nails as if she were bringing an offering. "Wax, leather, and patience," she announced as if she were naming the day's ingredients. The twins tumbled in, cheeks bright with deliberate earnestness, their pockets already heavy with items they insisted might be handy later. A loop of twine, a bright button, a piece of ribbon that had clearly been prized. They stood together on the porch, a small assembly of familiar presences, and looked up at the awning. The seam showed itself plainly in the day. The leather had split from its stitch, and the putty that sat between the lead and the frame had given up its hold in one small, perfectly ordinary place. Seamus rubbed his chin and produced from a hidden pocket a narrow strip of leather, worn but unbroken, that he had slotted into his coat almost as if it were a talisman. "We'll take it down," he said simply. "We can tack on a tidy backing, press it in with wax and a little patience, and then stitch a ribbon to hide where the patch meets the old seam." "You'll stand on the step," Lily said, finding the manner of command that came from habit rather than authority. She had the step, the round-backed chair that sometimes served as a small ladder, and she placed it beneath the awning with careful hands. The twins volunteered to hold the nails in a small cup, their idea of involvement making their faces glow with considerable self-importance. The work began as most good, riotously gentle jobs do, with the passing of possessions. Seamus laid the leather against the seam, and Rose softened the beeswax until it was pliable between her thumb and forefinger, the faint, sweet smell rising like a domestic incense. Lily fetched a pot of warm water and the tin of putty. She wiped the softened plaster away with practiced strokes, revealing the clean wood beneath as if peeling a letter from an envelope. The twins tied their threads and arranged their buttons as if on a jeweler's tray. The house, for its part, watched and answered in a chorus of small sounds. Kettle boiling gently in the kitchen, the clock's tender talk, a scrap of torn paper blown by a stray draught. Hands found old rhythms. Seamus, who had been a cobbler by thrift in his younger days, shaped the leather to the curve of the awning, with the steady patience of someone who had done such things without thinking. He bored holes along the edge with an awl that had a wooden handle smoothed by many fingers. Rose took the leftover cloth and threaded a needle with waxed thread that glinted like a tiny rope. Lily held the leather to keep it taut, while Seamus drove small brass tacks home with a reverent, certain hand. The sound of the hammer was never loud. It was the sound of work making promises. At one point, as the seam took shape under their care, the twins produced the sun catchers, little rounds of boiled sugar, cooled and bright as little coins, strung on lengths of thread. Mara had melted sugared syrup into a shallow tin the day before, and had cut the cooled panes with the careful precision of one who had practiced curiosity. They hung the sugar panes from the awning's small ribs, and from the inside of the bay window, where the light could pry the brightness from them and throw playful spots across the kitchen table. When the sun caught them for a moment between a cloud and the eaves, it looked for an instant like a stitched line of tiny stained-glass windows. "Like a string of small suns," said Rose softly, and no one argued with the description. The sugar did not last forever. It was fragile and smelled faintly of boiled syrup and lemon. But in that moment it refracted the light into something celebratory and new. There was a harmonizing of voices without anyone meaning to choreograph it. Someone hummed a tune that might have been an old lullaby. Another voice picked up a phrase, and the sound became a slow, cheerful round. The work was punctuated with small talk. Seamus telling of a time he had mended a fisherman's net with nothing but an old shoelace and a ruler. Rose describing her plans for a new herb bed near the kitchen door. Lily remembering where she'd once stitched a child's name into a pocket of a winter coat. Each anecdote was a small celebration of that particular sort of thrift and intention that made a life hold together. As they stitched, they made choices about how to finish the visible seam. It would be easy, Seamus said, to hide the patch. That would be neat, but forgettable. Rose proposed a thin ribbon, sewn in and knotted at intervals to make the seam look deliberate. The twins suggested using the bright blue button that Joss had found along the high road, and Lily proposed a sprig of rosemary laid into the topmost stitch, both to scent the patch and to mark it as belonging to the house's own body. They worked until the light leaned away and painted the kitchen in a warmer color. The awning, once loose and complaining, sat firm and tidy against the eaves. The leather patch, stained a little from the wax and the handling, took the form of a tiny banner. They pegged the edges with brass washers that Seamus had found in a dingy drawer, and pressed putty into the hairline seam with the same kind of care as if icing the faint lip of a cake. When at last they tied the ribbon and threaded the button through the loop, it resembled less a repair than a piece of deliberate ornament. They stood back and regarded it as if admiring the new face of somebody they loved. The seam carried, now, the fingerprints of a small coalition, the nick of Seamus's thumb, the faint wax smudge of Rose, a child's indentation where Joss had tried too earnestly to press the button into place. Lily touched it, as if to check that it was true. The awning believed the pressure, and sat in the light as if it had always been so. The house seemed to breathe a little deeper, satisfied. There was tea for celebration. Scones came hot from the oven, and jam that had been set aside tasted sweeter for the work done. They ate with the sort of quiet pleasure reserved for small victories and ordinary domestic rites. The twins were given a special portion of jam to arrange in what they called precise dollops, and they took the task with solemnity. Seamus toasted a small ritual in his slow, amiable way, a lift of his cup in the direction of the awning. And Rose suggested that a candle be placed in the bay window to show those who passed that the house was kept and watched over. The candle placed in the window was a modest thing, but when they set it on the sill, behind the sugar panes, The light seemed to deepen, as if the small sun the twins had made had found a larger body to orbit. For the first time since the seam had been discovered, Lily felt the day fold into the shape of a circle rather than a question. The repair had become an event, and the event had become a memory already in the making. As the afternoon slid toward evening, the visitors began to take their leave with that quiet carefulness of ones who have been tended. Seamus buttoned his coat and pocketed a sliver of leather he declared might be of future use. Rose wrapped the towel over her arm and accepted a slice of scone for the road, pressing it into a piece of oilcloth the way one tucks away a note. The twins, cheeks flushed and hands sticky with jam, took one last sweep of the table for crumbs, as if performing the final act of a small rite. They left the house warmer for their passage. The seam held the memory of many hands, and Lily found herself smiling at the notion that the mark of their labor would show up in small ways for years. A wax smear where a child had rested a thumb, a floss of thread that had unpinned itself and now danced like a small flag. The awning would stand weather and keeping. Every time she looked at it, she would be reminded not of its fault, but of the warmth of those who had gathered to mend it. When the last foot had shuffled off and the door had closed on the soft echo of neighbors' good nights, Lily sat for a long moment at the table, hands folding and unfolding the cloth. The kitchen carried, at that point, a catalogue of scents: bergamot in the tea, cinnamon in the scones, the faint resin of wax, the sweet ghost of the sugar sun catchers. The stove hummed its steady tune, and the kettle, now emptied, warmed the air like a hand laid across the back of a neck. She did not tidy immediately. Instead, she stood and arranged one more small thing: a tiny garland made from leftover ribbon and a couple of buttons threaded through a scrap of string. She looped it over the mantel as if to give the room a soft, improvised crown. The act had the same quality as prayer without words, an offering of small beauty to the household. She turned then to the bay window and watched the candle glow behind the sugar panes. Outside, the rain had retreated to a discreet whisper. The road glistened. The puddles let themselves go without fuss. Night settled with a comfortable, inevitable slide. Lily lit the lamp and turned a page of her book, reading a line or two more for its particular tone than for any narrative need. The words were companionable but easily put down. She let them be company rather than counsel. She made the bed and slipped between its warmed sheets, pausing at the sill to press her palm again to the newly mended seam. Her fingers met the ribbon and a small scrawl of wax that looked, in the lamp's light, like a writing only hands could understand. It was a language of care. She slept as the house held the small, soft music of night. The stove's low breath, the drip of a distant water tank, the slow turning of the world as rain and sky came to terms. Her dreams were populated with hands passing thread, hands holding a small sun of sugar up to the light, hands translating weariness into labor. In the dream there was a hum that might have been the same tune as they had hummed over the patch, and the feeling of community felt like a warm garment wrapped around the chest. Dawn, after such a night, arrived in a quiet hue. The rain had stopped entirely, and left behind a washed clarity that made every cobble and pane take on a new definition. Lily woke to the thin, bright air that follows gentle weather, and, with the first cup of tea in the morning, walked out to whose light came through the sugar panes into little flecks on the table. The sun catchers, while fragile, had survived the night, and now refracted the fragile dawn into small, scattered diamonds. It was as if the room had been given a dozen small stars, held close and domestic. She moved about the kitchen with the same tender economy of gesture as always, but there was a small buoyancy to her. The seam had in effect rewritten itself as a modest emblem. She found that she took more care in her movements as if those small stitches required an audience. She put the kettle on and began making the sort of breakfast that tasted best after a shared day's labor. Porridge thickened with nutty oats, a drizzle of honey, the remainder of the jam for the scones, and a pot of tea that she kept on the hob to warm as people might call in. People did call in. It had been settled, by a kind of tacit agreement among them, that the mending of the seam invited a small get-together for a morning of finishing touches and a modest celebration of the new sun in the window. Neighbors came with homemade gingerbread, with a length of spare elastic cut neatly to size, with small, improbable gifts. A thimble, a strand of velvet ribbon, a crooked safety pin that had once belonged to a seafarer. The twins arrived bearing a crown of wildflowers they had tied with the solemnity of coronation, insisting that today the house must be royal for a while. The work of finishing was almost ceremonial. Seamus, who in his younger days had known the patience of careful trades, showed Joss how to make a simple stitch called a mattress stitch, to seal the edge of the leather without catching the same fabric twice. Rose, with the gardener's eye, arranged rosemary into the seam's topmost loop, to press a little scent into the night air. She plaited a small sprig with a loop of twine, and tucked it within a fold of leather, so that it would release its fragrance whenever the awning was ruffled by a breeze. The twins attached the final sugar panes in tidy rows, and children from the next street over, drawn by curiosity, soon joined with paper stars that they had folded hastily in school-time colors to add to the garland. There was a lightness to the afternoon that came from having elevated the repair into something decorative. People moved as if part of a parade, but spoke in the soft domestic voices of those who had been neighbors for years. They shared recipes as they stitched, songs as they hammered, and advice about how best to store the leather with wax so it would not crack when the seasons turned. The kitchen was full of small education: how to boil sugar to the proper amber, how to soften beeswax without letting it seize, how to hold a nail steady so that it did not make a rude surprise on impact. Lily found herself smiling often in the way one smiles when a tapestry unfolds. She held a thimble in her hand as if it were a small gold coin and passed it to Mara with a flourish. "Steady now," she said. "It helps to breathe with each stitch." Mara nodded solemnly and practiced the breath as if it were indeed a secret incantation, and then delivered a stitch that, though small, anchored the ribbon perfectly. At the end of the morning's labor there was a curious pause. Everyone stood back, hands wiped on aprons, and regarded the finished seam. It had been stitched into a small work of art, the leather neat and securely tacked, the putty smoothed, the ribbon tied with a small, jaunty bow, the button affixed like a tiny eye. Little sugar panes hung in a garland and threw their small lights across the wood. The rosemary breathed its pale, fresh scent into the room, and made the whole thing smell like a promise of good seasons to come. "It looks like a little theater," said a neighbor, and the word was apt. The awning had become an entrance, the bay window a stage for the domestic dramas of light and weather. They toasted, softly, to the seam, and to the reasons they found to mend one another. There was no speech-making, no grand notion brought forward. Only the quiet satisfaction of people who had made manifest their care in an object now visible from the road. After the work, as is customary in the small economies of a village, someone suggested that a modest celebration was in order. The oven, which had been doing quiet service, gave up a last pan of scones and a smaller, surprisingly handsome tart filled with berries that Rose had coaxed from a stubborn bush. Tea was decanted, cups were topped, and 2 new benches that had been brought from someone's shed were set out back where the rain had left the garden at its greenest. They ate and spoke until the light thinned to a polite golden, and the children grew sleepy in the manner only a day of concentrated industry can produce. The twins curled themselves into the lap of an aunt-like woman and were lulled into minor dreams. Seamus, who had given his time and a strip of leather that morning, had a readiness to indulge the children with stories of his misadventures. Each tale made more gentle for kids' small ears. Rose and Lily planned the next seed planting with grave, pleasurable intensity, as if they were plotting a year's festival. By late afternoon, the visitors had thinned. The house had been thoroughly aired, and smelled of broom-swept wood, and the faint, lingering, sugared scent of the sun-catchers. A neighbor on their way home stopped and raised a hand from the lane. "Looks very kept," she called, and Lily felt that the phrase had weight. To be kept was not just to be repaired, but to be loved enough to have time taken for one's small fixes. The twins were given a last task, to string one sugar pane on a thread and hang it so the last of the day's light might pass through and make the kitchen look, for a handful of minutes, like the inside of a small domestic cathedral. They did so with the gravity of children on the last page of a picture book, and when the pane caught the low sun, it threw a band of color across the tablecloth that resembled a promise. When at last the house grew quiet again, Lily went through the motions of preparing for bed, with the assurance of someone who has practiced this particular ritual a great many times. She set a small plate by the window for any passer-by who might be moved to pop in for a cup of tea, and she placed the kettle where, in the small hours, it might be given another warming if the mood struck. She wrapped the patchwork over the back of the chair and set a book down. She smoothed the napkins, ran a cloth over the table until the grain of the wood shone faintly, and then, satisfied, took off her boots and tucked the toes into her slippers. At the bay window she stood for a while, feeling the repaired seam beneath her fingers. It bore the memory of everyone's work, a smear of beeswax, a faint dent from the twins' attempting fingernails, the neat row of brass tacks. Where once there had been a breach, now there was a small, deliberate ornamentation. The house, she realized, felt held in a different way. Not because the leather had been tacked on, but because of the many hands and the conversations and the songs that had passed through it that day. There is a particular kind of quiet after such a day. Not the hush of absence, but the settled contentment of a place that has been tended. Lily moved to bed with the ease of one who expected sleep to come, and it did so almost immediately. The day's care had exhausted the mind into the restful place where thoughts no longer pressed. The rain that came later that night, when it came, was light and sympathetic, respectful of the repairs and not inclined to test them further. Before she turned the final page of her book, she thought of the small things that keep a house, the little rituals, the offering of a plate, the sharing of tea, and how each acts like a stitch in the broader fabric of a life lived in common. There was a tenderness in the thought that made her smile in the dark. She put out the lamp and let the room hold its last glow. The sugar panes hung on their threads and caught a faint, distant lamp from the street. They made a small constellation of their own. If you enjoyed the quiet of this place and would like to share more evenings like it, you might like to subscribe for more gentle stories and the soft company of small rooms. It is a simple thing to do, and a tiny way to ensure that such moments find their way back to you. Now, as the house quieted into the steadier music of night, allow yourself one more breath. Let your shoulders drop where they are. Let the day settle into its habit. Imagine the steady, faithful patter of rain on a distant roof, the warm cup at your hand, the small light in a window that means someone inside has mended what needed mending. You may dim your screen now and let the kitchen and its people hold your sleep. The stove will keep its slow breath a little while yet, and the sugar panes will hold the last glint of lamplight. The seam is mended, the ribbon tied, the door crossbuck locked against the cold. Outside, the night rounds the cottages with the same careful hand that tied the ribbon. Inside, the house keeps those who have passed through it, and it will keep you too. Good night.